Hello, everyone, and welcome to the January 2022 presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History, and we'll be your host today. Before we begin today's presentation, and welcome to the January 2022 presentation. As a reminder, all recent, past, and future First Wednesday lectures are now available on our Friends of History webpage. Just click on the series link at the top of the home page. Our monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with support from the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These funds will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our website, click on the donate button at the top of the page. We have received a number of donations over the holidays, and we wish to thank our contributors for their generosity and support for this Friends of History program, as well as for History Museum programs and exhibits. We're continuing to explore options for our February presentation, and we'll let you know the details through our monthly email announcement and on our web pages. If you wish to learn more about this lecture and all upcoming lectures, we urge you to join our mailing list if you have not already done so, either via our web page or by mailing us at New Mexico History Museum, Friends of History @gmail.com. And now for today's lecture. Dr. Megan Kate Nelson's presentation today will be drawn from her new book, The Three-Cornered War, the Union, the Confederacy, and Native Peoples in the Fight for the West. This book was a 2021 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. We're happy to have her join us today. Dr. Nelson is an historian and writer with a BA from Harvard and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. She writes about the Civil War, the U.S. West, and American landscapes of memory for the New York Times, Washington Post, the Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, Preservation Magazine, and Civil War Times. Scribner's will publish her next book, Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America, in March 2022. In today's lecture, Dr. Nelson draws from extensive historical materials, focusing on 9 charismatic individuals who fought for self-determination and control of the region during the Civil War, and whose actions revealed the importance of such individual efforts in the midst of the larger military conflict between 1861 and 1865. Among these individuals are included such well-known figures as John R. Baylor, Texas legislator who established the Confederate territory of Arizona across the southern parts of present-day Arizona and New Mexico, U.S. Colonel Edward Canby's wife, Louisa Hawkins, who nursed Confederate soldiers back to health in Santa Fe, and Kit Carson, who led a regiment of volunteers against the Texans, Navajos, Kiowas, and Comanches. As well as some lesser-known individuals, she also talks about Juanita, a Navajo weaver who resisted Union campaigns against her people, and Mangus Colorados, a revered Chiricahua Apache chief who worked to expand Apache territory in Arizona. Drawing on the personal history or memoirs of these individuals, Dr. Nelson's narrative offers a fresh and more complete look at Civil War events in the New Mexico territory beyond the well-known battles of Valverde and Glorieta Pass, to include the start of the Apache Wars and events leading to the Navajo Long Walk and its consequences. Following the presentation, Dr. Nelson will answer any questions you may have. The questions and comments can be posted at any time in the YouTube chat room, both during and after the presentation. As always, upon completion of today's event, the entire presentation will be posted on the Friends of History webpage, as well as on the History Museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. So let us now welcome Dr. Megan Kate Nelson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ben, and thank you to the Friends of History for inviting me to be here tonight to talk about my most recent book, The Three-Cornered War, which tells the story of the Civil War in the Southwest. So I have some slides to show you, so I will share those with you now. There we go. So I first started thinking about this book project when I was teaching classes in Civil War history at both Texas Tech and Cal State Fullerton. And I heard about and read about these battles in New Mexico, Valverde, Apache Canyon, Glorieta Pass, and was shocked that I had not ever heard of them before. I grew up in Colorado. I didn't know about these battles. I didn't know there was a far Western theater in the war that was really positioned in the desert Southwest. I didn't know that Colorado soldiers were deeply involved in defending New Mexico territory from a Confederate invasion. And as a historian, whenever I find out that there's something I don't know and something I'd never heard of before, that really motivates me to start researching. And so that's why I really started looking into the Civil War in this theater and quickly came to discover that the battles were not just between U.S. troops and Confederate troops, but between U.S. troops, Confederate troops, and Indigenous peoples, particularly Chiricahua Apaches and Navajo peoples in New Mexico and Arizona. And this, I thought, was a really interesting element of the war in this theater that we don't see in other places in the Trans-Mississippi or the Eastern theaters of the war. And so, of course, that interested me as well, that this was really a new vision of the Civil War that really convinced me that it is a continental conflict. And this is something that we have not really talked about a lot in Civil War history and Civil War research and writing. So I also discovered pretty early on that this was a very complicated story, a lot of different communities in play, moving through kind of the huge distances and desert landscapes of the desert Southwest. And so I knew I had to tell the story in a different kind of way. I wanted to really anchor you in the experiences of individuals. And so I borrowed a strategy from literature, the multi-perspective narrative, and really tried in this book to kind of put you down in New Mexico and Arizona, parts of Texas, California, with 9 different people whose kind of life stories I tell, but whose kind of lives between 1861 and 1868 become the focus of the book. For those of you who have read it already, you know who those 9 people are. For those of you who have not, I am going to introduce you to a couple of these protagonists, as I call them, even though they were real people, real living people in the mid-19th century. But I kind of like the word protagonists because they were kind of taking action in this moment to determine the future of the West. And so those of you who haven't read it yet, I will introduce you to a few of these protagonists tonight and also introduce everyone to a couple of the sources that I used in order to really excavate their stories, including one really great collection at the Chavez Library at the New Mexico Museum, New Mexico History Museum. So first, I'll give you a bit of an overview. I'm assuming that those of you who are fans of New Mexico history know more about this than some of my other audiences might, but I'll give you the brief overview, and of course we can talk in the Q&A about more details if you wish. So in the spring of 1861, the real question was, why would the Confederates send an army to try and take New Mexico territory? And why was the U.S. Army interested in retaining it? Well, really for 3 really important reasons. One was for gold. As we all know, fighting wars cost money, and both the U.S. and the Confederacy needed money to fight the wars in other theaters. And the gold mines of the Rocky Mountains and the Sierras in California were very, very important to them and very lucrative sources of a potential new source of money. So gold was the first. Second, Pacific ports. Even at this point in the spring and early summer of the war, the Confederacy knew a blockade was coming using U.S. naval ships. They were already starting to have trouble shipping things out of their ports. And so the idea of having control of the deep water ports in San Diego and Los Angeles, possibly even San Francisco, very alluring to the Confederacy. And of course, the U.S. wanted to keep those ports out of Confederate hands. Again, because if they could stop them from shipping anything out or bringing them in, they would really, really hurt the Confederate war effort. Now, the third reason, which is really something that we don't talk about a lot in Civil War history, but some scholars have, is this. The third reason that the U.S. and the Confederacy were interested in the West is because they each had visions of the future that involved that region. Whenever we talk about U.S. history in the broad frame of the 19th century, we're always talking about the West when we talk about the 1840s and the 1850s, right? All of the debates and the disagreements that drove the U.S. and the southern states to war were based in the West, and the future of the West and the future of slavery in the Western territories. But then the cannons fire on Fort Sumter, and it's like the West doesn't even exist anymore in most Civil War histories that we hear about and we read, right? And in a lot of Civil War classes also. But that, of course, as you probably know, was not the case. The West continued to be extremely important to both the U.S. and the Confederacy for envisioning a future for themselves and for the nation. For the United States, this future involved a land of free labor, a land without enslavement from coast to coast. For the Confederacy, it involved a vision of a coast-to-coast empire of slavery, where they could establish enslavement all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and then possibly even use the Southwest as an anchor from which to move south. Once they defeated the Union, then maybe they could move south, take Mexico, take the Caribbean, maybe parts even of Central and South America in this expanding kind of maybe even hemispheric empire of slavery. So that was the goal, and that was the dream, and that is what was driving Henry Hopkins Sibley, who was a career military man. He had been based in Taos at the beginning of the war. He resigned his commission, went east in the summer of 1861, met with Confederate President Jefferson Davis and pitched him this plan to create an army of Texans that would invade New Mexico territory, which, as you can see from this map, in 1861 actually encompassed what we now know of as New Mexico and Arizona. So all the way from that eastern border of Texas all the way to the Colorado River and the border of California. Sibley's plan was to take this army. They would have a wagon train, but they would try to subsist themselves on the road by following these major trails that had a lot of federal forts along the way. They would sack each of those forts, take their provisions and their arms, and keep moving. And his thought was he could become entrenched in New Mexico territory, drive west through southern New Mexico into California, take Los Angeles and San Diego, and then maybe even move up the Rio Grande, move into Colorado territory, and move west over on the Oregon Trail and take Northern California. So this was Sibley's plan. Jefferson Davis approved this plan, sent him on his way, and the first phase of the war then began in the summer of 1861. So the Civil War in the far West occurred in 4 phases. Again, I'm going to talk very briefly about these tonight, but we can, if you have questions about them, of course, we can discuss them in the Q&A. So the first phase was Confederate invasion. This began in January of 1861. It had 2 parts. The first part was under the command of John Baylor, a cavalry officer who brought at first 1,000 men with him from San Antonio west along the El Paso San Antonio road. He left men at every single federal installation that he passed. And so by the time he got to El Paso, he had between 300 and 400 men on horseback. John Baylor is the first protagonist you will meet in the Three-Cornered War. I knew I needed to start this book with him because this is the first military movement in the war, also because he was a rather spectacular character in his own right. He was ambitious and impatient and profoundly racist. He was a violent man, again, prone to spontaneous action and sort of taking matters into his own hands, which was rather easy to do in this theater of the war because it was so far away from the heads of departments and any superiors that Baylor had, that he was able to just take action and then inform his superiors of what he did. After the fact, because it would have taken him a month to inform all the military personnel back in Texas of what he wanted to do and to get permission and then be notified of that permission. So this is one of those interesting parts. This is one of those interesting things about the Southwestern theater, the far Western theater of the Civil War that makes it a little different from other theaters, is that all of the men in command here basically just did what they wanted. They had very little oversight. So they were driven a lot by ambitions and scheming. So John Baylor had gotten to El Paso in late July, and he had heard that the commander in charge of the U.S. troops, ERS Canby, whose wife Louisa called him Richard, so I refer to him as Richard in the book, even though he signed everything, ERS Canby. He had heard that Canby was coalescing troops. He was bringing them from forts all over New Mexico and concentrating them at Fort Craig in central New Mexico, right on the Rio Grande, in order to face a possible Confederate threat. And Baylor decided that he really needed to move before Sibley's much larger army of 3,000 men could get there to help him. So in late July, of his own volition, Baylor and his men crossed the border, invaded the Union territory of New Mexico, took the town of Mesilla, forced the surrender of Fort Fillmore, which was one of the first major surrenders of the war of more than 400 officers and their families, and then returned to Mesilla, sat down on August 1st, 1861, and created the Confederate territory of Arizona, which you can see here on this 1862 map. It's one of the few maps we have that shows this development in the Southwestern theater. But here you can see in pink the Confederacy expanding all the way to the California border. The Confederate territory of Arizona, Baylor created because he knew quite well that it was the southern portion of New Mexico territory that was pro-Confederate, that was pro-secessionist. The way that migration streams worked in the 1840s and 50s meant that most of the Anglo migrants that had been moving from east to west were coming from the southern states. And so they were more likely to be pro-Confederate, to be pro-slavery. So Baylor sat down, created this Confederate territory of Arizona, which looks very different from Arizona looks now. But this was the state of the war pretty soon after it started in the Eastern Theater. So coming behind him was, in fact, Sibley with his 3,000 men, although they did not arrive until late December, early January of 1861-62, mostly because Sibley was a man of big ideas, but he was not particularly good at organization or paperwork. And he ran into a lot of delays creating the wagon train, getting provisions for his troops, getting arms, some arms for his troops. And so they did not actually leave San Antonio until the fall. Pretty late in the season, they ran into a lot of storms. And by the time they got to El Paso and Mesilla, they were pretty wiped out. So they waited for a month and rested themselves and their animals before they started moving north to begin phase 2 of the war in the Southwest, which was the series of battles between the U.S. Army and the Confederates, which began at the Battle of El Verde on February 21st, When Sibley brought his troops up, he thought about assaulting Fort Craig directly, but pretty quickly figured out that that was going to be difficult to do. It was really well defended, and Canby had more troops than he did. So he decided to move around. They crossed the Rio Grande to the east. They moved north and tried to recross it at Valverde. And this was the one-day battle along that river, which the Confederates won in a late day charge across the field of battle, where they took the U.S. guns and then turned them on the soldiers as they fled back across the Rio Grande and back to Fort Craig. At this point, Sibley's troops took a couple days to recover, deal with their men who had been injured and killed, and then started moving north. They took Albuquerque, then they took Santa Fe, and by early March, they were there, but they were really running out of provisions, because one of the things that was a problem for Sibley about not attacking Fort Craig directly is that he was not able to then overthrow that fort and get all of the food and the ammunition, the supplies for their horse and mule herd and their cow herd that would help sustain them on the road. So they were really hurting. They got some supplies in Albuquerque and some in Santa Fe, but not enough to sustain an army of more than 2,000 men on the move. So they decided they needed to keep moving and perhaps actually lay siege to Fort Union, which was northeast of Santa Fe. The ruins of Fort Union are still there along I-25, a great place to visit if you have not yet been. So they started on the road. They started on the Santa Fe Trail to try and go take that fort in late March and met on the road an army of Colorado gold miners who had marched south from Denver City in the weeks before, who were led by a Denver lawyer named John Slew. And this is probably the most famous engagement. Many of you have probably, if you haven't been to these sites, you've definitely driven past them, have heard about them. Apache Canyon was a little bit of a draw. The Confederates kept marching and met the U.S. soldiers at Glorieta 2 days later. And they actually did win that fight, but very famously, John Chivington took a third of the U.S. troops, went up Glorieta Mesa and down and around the Confederate troops and attacked their wagon train and destroyed it. And without that wagon train, Sibley could not hope to keep marching into Colorado territory. There was no way that his men would survive without their supplies and without any food. And so he began, and his troops began a massive retreat in the beginning of April, all the way through late July of 1862, where they marched, many of them on foot, some on horseback, but many on foot, from that battlefield of Glorieta all the way back to San Antonio. And here you can see their retreat line here in blue. They took a kind of major diversion to try and get around Canby's troops, who were shadowing them across the other, on the other bank of the Rio Grande River, to make sure that they made their way south and then back across the border into Confederate Texas. Now, the whole time that this was happening, Chiricahua Apaches, Mescalero Apaches, and Navajos were raiding both U.S. and Confederate troops. They were siphoning off weapons and horses and mules and some cattle, and they were really affecting the manpower of both the U.S. and the Confederate troops in this region. So the three-cornered war of the U.S., the Confederacy, and Native peoples was occurring from the very beginning of the campaigns here in the Southwest, although it would become much more intensive and more targeted in the next two phases. Now, one of the soldiers who was fighting for the U.S. Army, who fought at Valverde, and then Peralta, and which was a kind of retreat, minor retreat action between U.S. and Confederate soldiers while they were retreating down the Rio Grande. One of the men who participated in that was Alonzo Ickes. He is one of the protagonists in the book. He was the first person I kind of found and chose for the book project and decided to write about. I found his diary in the Denver Public Library in 2010, which is when I first started thinking about this project. And it's a really fantastic source. It is one of the few kind of full sources that we have, giving the soldier's point of view, the kind of private's common soldier point of view during this conflict. And when I read it, Alonzo Ickes really kind of leapt off the page to me. He had come to Denver in 1859 as part of the gold rush. This, again, was another event I wasn't very familiar with, even growing up in Colorado. And it's really important. The discovery of gold and that gold rush brought tens of thousands of young men of military age to Colorado territory. And many of them were still there in the summer and fall of 1861 when the calls for troops went out to defend New Mexico territory. So gold miners have a very large role in this story, and Alonzo Ickes helps me to tell that story and to really explain the very important role that gold played in this conflict in the West. So phase 3 of the Civil War in the Southwest took place in a different sort of area, but brought another group of soldiers into the Southwestern region as part of the Civil War. This was the California Column, a group of about 2,000 cavalry and infantry, marching from Los Angeles all the way to the Rio Grande from early March 1862 to July and into August. These soldiers were under the command of James Henry Carleton, another career military man. He was actually born in Maine, but spent most of his military career at frontier forts in the West, had actually been posted in Albuquerque in the 1850s, where he had met Kit Carson, who is another one of the protagonists in the book. Now, Carleton did not have abundant experience in the field of battle, but he was an excellent organizer. He was extraordinarily type A. He paid attention to details, and he was really training all of these men for multiple months to march, go on this very long, over 700-mile desert march through Southern California into Southern Arizona and to the Rio Grande during this period. Now, they had planned to leave in December 1861, but a couple of days before, it started to rain, and it did not stop raining for 6 weeks. This was the effect of a weather event that we've become more and more familiar with lately, the bomb cyclone, and it just poured more than a foot of rain, even more than 2 feet of rain on Southern California and parts of Northern California also during this period. So basically, the road that they were supposed to take was completely covered by water. They had to wait until it dried out completely, which was March 1862. During that time, Carleton continued to drill his troops, continued to get provisions for them. He sent small groups along the road ahead to cache hay, to dig out wells. And he did a couple of things, which Sibley also did, but not as efficiently and not as successfully, which was he staggered his troops along the road. And he also arranged for them to march at night and really managed all the natural resources of the desert Southwest in the best possible way. And in fact, Carleton, except for these battles at Picacho Pass and Apache Pass, did not lose any men to illness, to sunstroke, to dehydration. It was really kind of a remarkable achievement given the environmental stresses of these marches. And this is another really interesting component of this theater, is the extent to which the kind of landscape makes itself felt, right? The dry climate, the elevation. This is what accounts for Sibley's loss. Without that wagon train, he would not survive. And that is pretty much solely due to the fact that this was high desert country. And it's very hard to survive there if you do not have an adequate source of food and water. You usually can't find it for yourself if you somehow get separated from major waterways. So Carleton was particularly good and efficient at this. Picacho Pass was a very short engagement, is known as sort of the westernmost battle if you don't count Stanwix Station, a couple of days earlier, of the Civil War in the Southwest. And this was a fight between kind of an advance guard of Carleton's men and a couple of pickets who had been sent out. John Baylor had sent men west on this mail road that connected Mesilla and Los Angeles, trying to scout for Union troops, also to kind of clear the way for Sibley's men if they had chosen to march west. They ran into each other at Picacho Pass on April 15th. There were losses on both sides, but the Confederates started to retreat from there and then joined their troops to retreat back to Texas a couple of weeks later. As they moved east, Carleton's California column met Chiricahua Apaches who were defending their homeland against this latest incursion of white soldiers. The Battle of Apache Pass took place on July 15th. The U.S. Army won that battle. Chiricahuas lost control of Apache Spring, which was a vital site of and a vital site and water supply thoroughfare in southern, what is now Arizona, but then southern New Mexico territory and Apacheria. And so it was a pivotal battle for multiple reasons, and you see it from a couple of different perspectives in the book. One of the reasons it's a really important battle for really the future of this region is that when Carleton came through Apache Pass a couple of weeks after the battle and he saw the graves of his soldiers there, he became really enraged. And he had been kind of in the couple of months before fairly open to negotiating with Indigenous groups he came across along the way. And in fact, had made several alliances with what were called the Pima and Maricopa peoples at that time, so that they would provide his men with food in exchange for weapons and other items and cloth. And so he was willing to negotiate with Indigenous groups. But when he got to Apache Pass, he decided that he was not going to negotiate with Chiricahua Apaches, and that instead he would form another battle plan entirely. And that is what led to the fourth and final phase of the Civil War in the Southwest, which were the U.S. Army campaigns against Native peoples, which started in the fall of 1862, once Carleton arrived first on the Rio Grande, and then he went north to Santa Fe. Canby was sort of reassigned to lead troops in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, and Carleton took over as the commander of the Department of New Mexico. So once he took over, he really started to articulate this plan, which was a new way of seeing U.S. Indian policy. Previously, U.S. Army officials and Office of Indian Affairs agents had really tried to hammer out treaties with Indigenous peoples before they resorted to warfare. Carleton decided that treaties were no longer going to happen. War would be the first move. And the purpose of that war would not be to establish a peace treaty, but to remove Indigenous peoples from their homelands, to place them on reservations, and then to open their lands for sale to white settlers. Carleton put this plan in motion in two different campaigns, one in the South against Chiricahua Apaches, which was led by Joseph Rodman West. They were mostly interested in forcing the surrender of Mangus Coloradus, who was the great war chief of the Chiricahuas. He's also another protagonist in the book. They did manage to capture him, luring him into a parley, but soldiers killed him while he was a prisoner. In January of 1863, Carleton believed that this would sort of stop the war with the Apaches. Without his leadership, the Apaches could not go on, but he was incredibly wrong about that, and many other things during these campaigns. The death of Mangus Coloradus galvanized Chiricahua Apaches and began the Apache Wars that lasted into the 1880s. So the U.S. Army was never successful in their fights against Mangus Coloradus or the Chiricahuas during this period. In northern New Mexico, and then what would become the U.S. territory of Arizona in 1863, the U.S. Army was more successful. Here, the campaigns were led by Kit Carson, who was Carleton's favorite officer in the field. There was a very short campaign against Mescalero Apaches in the fall of 1862, and Carson sent them, a small group of about 400 or 500 people, to Bousque Redondo, which was a reservation Carleton had chosen himself and had surveyed and had set aside for not only Mescalero Apaches, but also Navajos, who he planned to campaign against in 1863. So I had said before that Carleton was this great kind of organizational commander, and he was indeed, but in this moment, it was probably due to his racism and due to his kind of lack of experience in this region, in this context, he made a lot of mistakes that ultimately led to a really terrible human rights crisis at Bousque Redondo. To some extent, the weather was to blame, but mostly I think we can put all of the human blame on James Carleton for the disaster that Bousque Redondo became. His officers had told him that site was not suitable for large numbers of people to try and farm, and he did not listen to them. He had chosen that site, he was wedded to it, and he would not listen to reason. Then he sent Kit Carson against the Navajos, starting in the summer of 1863, told him to use hard war tactics where they would destroy the crops, all the belongings of any Navajo peoples they came across, and force them into surrender because they would be starving and unable to care for themselves. He also forced Carson into a campaign against them in the winter because he rightly guessed that they would be most vulnerable at that moment in their camps around Canyon de Chelly. So starting in January of 1864, the long walk of the Navajo peoples began, lasted most intensively for about 4 months, but really for about 2 years, from 1864 to the fall of 1866. Carleton had thought that there would only really be about 2,000 Navajos who would be forcibly removed to Bousque Redondo. In reality, there were about 10,000, and that created a major survival crisis for them, not only on the Long Walk itself, which, as you can see, one of the major routes here, there were 4 routes total, but this is one of the major ones. It was more than a 400-mile march that most Navajos made on foot, although some of them were on horseback. So there was a very high mortality rate along the road during the Long Walk, and then about a 25% mortality rate at Bousque Redondo itself for the next 4 years while the Navajo people were incarcerated there. And I use the word incarceration deliberately because I think there are ways that we can look at Bousque Redondo kind of right next to other prisoner of war camps during the war on both the U.S. and the Confederate side. There were lots of parallels in terms of, humanitarian crises, disease spread, lack of provisions, lack of the ability to create housing and protection for themselves. Here you can see what the lack of trees around Bousque Redondo resulted in, which was shelters that were made out of mud and sticks and kind of partially buried into the ground, which is not a traditional domestic structure for the Navajo people. They were just trying to survive in this new kind of climate, this new landscape for them. Beginning in 1864. The situation there, as I have noted, was a disaster. Worm infestations destroyed most of the Navajos' corn crops, which they had planted to feed themselves. Carleton could never really get enough provisions to feed them adequately. They were left kind of out in the open with these kinds of shelters, which were not adequate. People were dying of all kinds of exposure diseases like pneumonia, and then also, the diseases that were spreading, as you would imagine here, as they did in prison camps, dysentery, malaria, measles, diseases of that nature. The situation was so bad that the Navajos really began to call, from the very beginning, they called Bousque Redondo Whaledy, which means land of suffering. So the protagonist, who the reader follows through these experiences, not only of resistance to U.S. soldiers, but then ultimate surrender, removal to Bousque Redondo, the Long Walk, and then 2 years spent in those conditions at Bousque Redondo, is Juanita, who was a weaver, a woman of great note, who was married to Manuelito, one of the great headmen of the Navajo people. I first found out about her through the amazing work of her descendant, Jennifer Nesdenetdale, a Navajo historian who researched her ancestors' history and shared that history with non-Native scholars. I really wanted to talk about Juanita because not only was her experience a civilian experience of the war, which is important to note. Wars don't just happen on battlefields between soldiers. They happen to everybody. Their influence is quite widespread among a lot of different kinds of communities. And so I wanted to tell that story. And then I also, because she was a weaver, and she's depicted here, this is actually a photograph that was taken in 1874 during a Navajo visit to a delegation visit to Ulysses S. Grant in Washington, D.C. And Juanita is pictured here in a dress of her own making, and then among other forms of textiles. And I really wanted to talk about the important role of women in Navajo society and weaving. Navajo blankets and clothing were really important elements of the Southwestern trade before Anglos arrived, before the Spanish and Mexicans arrived, and they became this really, really coveted trade item, and gave women in Navajo society a lot of influence. So I was very interested in the influence of the Bousque Redondo period on Navajo weaving, and did some research into these textiles. I'm an American Studies PhD. I like to use, I use battle records and diaries and letters and all kinds of documents in my work, but I also like to use visual culture and also material culture. And so this project enabled me to use textiles in a really interesting way. And textile historians have concluded that there was a shift at Bousque Redondo because of the pressure that reservation experience put on women and their families, and because their sheep herds were so depleted. What ended up happening is that Carleton was actually importing different kinds of sheep and then also ultimately yarn that was produced in a factory in Germantown, Pennsylvania. And so we have a shift not only in the kind of colors and designs of textiles during the Bousque Redondo period, but also in the materials themselves. And that was very interesting to me, that here women are using a skill that they had honed over generations, still to protect their families, to keep the community running, but they're responding kind of in situ and in that moment to the conditions, and also using the materials they had at hand. There were different kinds of dyes available to them, and they didn't have what they had in their homeland to create different colors. They often bartered with U.S. soldiers for their jackets so that they could unravel the blue and use it in their weaving. So this is a way you see just kind of one of the major impacts of Bousque Redondo on the Navajo people, who were there incarcerated on this reservation until 1868, when they were able to negotiate their way out and back to their homeland, which is a kind of bittersweet ending to that period in Navajo history. And it also serves as the ending of the book itself. So finally, I wanted to introduce you to one of the protagonists in the book, because he has a specific connection, of course, to Santa Fe and to the Chavez Library, but also because he's the connection to my next book that's coming out in March. So John Clark was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. He was appointed by Lincoln, and he is giving another one of the civilian perspectives in the book. He arrives in October of 1861. He's there for most of the action, although he does flee from Santa Fe as the Confederates are coming forward. So he's actually not there for the occupation of Santa Fe or for the battles of Apache Canyon and Glorieta. But he returns after everything is resolved, and he really is there for the duration of the book and is quite a good observer of Santa Fe society, meticulous in his journal writing. And I first ran into him at the Chavez Library. The John Clark diaries are there, luckily for me, transcribed as well, even though his handwriting is actually quite lovely and readable. And he turned out to be a huge gift. Initially, I was just going to use him to provide a kind of color commentary about Santa Fe during the war. But as I started reading through his diary entries, I figured out that he was actually really involved not in the soldiering aspect of the war, but in all of the other aspects. He surveyed Bousque Redondo. He went out to Arizona in 1863 to investigate the rumors of gold discoveries there. And then he brought word back, and he was pretty much single-handedly responsible for spreading the word of that gold rush, which then gave Carleton kind of more of a justification for his campaigns, particularly against Navajos, because you had to get to those gold fields. You had to move through the lands of the Navajo people, although you could also get there on the southern road through Apacheria as well. The journals are in pretty pristine condition at the Chavez Library. They led me to his papers at the National Archives, which are also in pristine condition. You can see them in their box here. And you can see the extent on the right with this like really quite beautiful plat map that he made of Santa Fe during this period that it seemed to me as I was looking through them that John Clark wrote his updates to the General Land Office. He created maps like these. He folded them up, he sealed them, he sent them. A clerk opened them in Washington, D.C., read them, and then closed them back up again and stored them. And it's possible that only a handful of people after that moment really opened them back up again, because they, the creases are so sharp and they're in really good shape. There are almost no stains. Really, really beautiful. And it really, looking into John Clark really helped me appreciate surveyors, and especially these surveyor generals who were civil appointees. And Clark, was there on the behest of the Lincoln administration. He was a Republican. He was their sort of representative in Santa Fe during this time, or one of them. And he played a very important role in determining the future of New Mexico. And it was through my research into Clark that I started thinking more broadly about surveys during this period in the American West. And that led me to the Hayden Survey of 1871, which was the first scientific survey into Yellowstone, which led directly to the passage of the Yellowstone Act on March 1st of 1872. The 150th anniversary of that is coming up this next year, and my book, Saving Yellowstone, is going to be published kind of on that date in kind of consort with that anniversary. So in that, I tell the story of Ferdinand Hayden, who was a scientific surveyor, a geologist. He was a different kind of appointee from John Clark, but they had the same goals, which was to measure and understand the West through its landscape and its resources, and to promote white settlement of the West. So if you are interested in Yellowstone, if you're interested in surveying, this might be the book for you as well. But that gives you a sense, too, of how, as a historian, I tend to find my projects as I'm researching the current project. So, Clark kind of led me to Ferdinand Hayden and to this new book. So in conclusion, what do we really learn when we see a familiar event like the Civil War from an unexpected place like New Mexico and Arizona in the 1860s? Well, one of the things I think we learned is that the U.S. Civil War was a continental conflict. It did not take place just in the Trans-Mississippi at Shiloh. It did not just take place in Georgia during Sherman's March or during the Virginia campaigns. It took place from coast to coast, and that a lot of different people were involved in fighting on all different sides during this period. I think it also shows us that the far Western theater was, as I have pointed out, kind of along the way, a really interesting and unique place to fight a war, not only due to the desert landscape, the distance from the centers of power, the really very real impact of natural resources and sort of driving the war toward this place, and really sparking the desires of a lot of different communities, Anglo and Hispano and Indigenous, to control this region. This is when we look at the war in a broader frame, we can see how diverse armies really were. Canby's U.S. Army of New Mexico was the most diverse army in the war overall, with Anglo soldiers, Hispano soldiers, and militia, and Indigenous scouts and spies from multiple nations. And when we only look at the Southeast, I mean, we're looking at very important developments. We're looking at the introduction of Black soldiers into the U.S. Army, but we tend to then ignore these other armies that are even more diverse and even more complex and complicated in terms of the goals that are driving all of the soldiers engaging in this theater. I think also we learn a kind of hard truth about the war, the Civil War. I think a lot of times we think of the Union War as a just war because soldiers in the East were fighting for emancipation by 1863 and bringing Black soldiers into the army there. But when we look at the Southwest, we see that the U.S. Army was simultaneously fighting to either exterminate or remove Native peoples from their homelands, to dispossess them of those lands, and to really kind of forcibly incarcerate them on these reservations. And that's really hard, I think, for us to reconcile. But it was very easy for Republicans, for Northerners, to reconcile this, because to them, emancipation in the East and Native extermination in the West, they've suited the same goal, right? This was all about the future of a West full of white farmers and ranchers and other settlers, and free of enslavement, and also free of Native encroachment. So overall, seeing familiar events from unexpected places really kind of rocks the boat a little bit. It changes our expectations, and it really enables us to see that the Civil War was a truly national event. So I will stop there, and we can get ready for the Q&A, because I'm sure you have lots of questions and a lot of interesting comments, especially those of you who have a lot of experience in the history of this region.
Kate, thank you very much for this truly full and rich discussion of the Civil War in New Mexico and its importance to the outcome of the United States during and after this most defining moment in U.S. history. For our audience, as we start this session, there's a number of opportunities here for you to ask your questions, and we strongly encourage you to do so. You can enter any questions you have in the chat room space on YouTube and in Facebook, and we will do our best to get to those questions through this period. I also want to thank everyone for attending. This is one of the largest audiences we've had in recent times, and it's always much appreciated by everyone. I'd like to start just to kind of get things going and highlight on your use of narratives of your 9 protagonists. You've highlighted a number of them, and I was wondering if there were you wish to make comments on any of the others, and perhaps give us a perspective in terms of who your favorite protagonists were. Certainly has been implied in much of your discussion.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great question. It was actually really hard to narrow it down to just 9 people. I think a lot of people may say, wow, 9 is really a lot, but there were so many interesting figures who kind of came to the forefront during this period. And I really wanted to provide a lot of balance between the perspectives. And so I definitely wanted a lot of, kind of US Army perspectives. I wanted civilians, I wanted Indigenous peoples, I wanted Confederates. And hopefully I found that good balance. I will say, much like Juanita, Louisa Canby was a very interesting person to write about because I didn't have any sources from her directly from this period in New Mexico. And whenever that happens, when you're a historian, then the challenge is, how do I bring this person to life when I don't have their words, right? And luckily for me, a lot of other people talked about Louisa Canby a lot, and I was able to kind of build a sense of her life, not only through the biography of her husband, which sort of tracked her across space, but also, through all of these other assessments of her from John Clark and other people who had met her in Santa Fe. So, and that was an interesting challenge for me. This was a new way of writing this narrative history and multi-perspective narrative. I had, written the 2 other books before, but in a very academic, argument-driven sort of style. So it was really fun to kind of get to know all of these people. And Louisa Canby, I know I've heard from other audiences that she is a kind of fan favorite because she's a civilian, because of all of the very interesting actions that she takes in Santa Fe, helping the Confederates, possibly, revealing where the materials were that were intended for Navajo peoples. I thought that really kind of made her a little bit more 3-dimensional. I was a little worried that she was a little too nice. But I think her attendance at seances and these kind of vaguely sketchy things she was doing actually made her a little more interesting. So, I think Juanita is definitely the heart of the book, as I said, and she was also really interesting to write about, kind of digging into Navajo history and women's history within a kind of larger Indigenous world was really interesting for me as a historian. I think the most hated protagonist in the book, it's a pretty close neck and neck race between Baylor, because he's so outsized in his violence and his, the actions he takes without orders. He does a lot of very bad things when he is in New Mexico. And James Carleton, who, pretty single-handedly turns the US Army effort against Indigenous peoples, and I think is primarily responsible for the disaster at Bousque Redondo and that extraordinarily high mortality rate. And, we try to say as historians that you don't ever want to kind of fall in love with your protagonists or the people that you're writing about. And I don't think I did that, but I definitely had my favorites it was fun to write about Baylor and what a terrible person he was. That was, not a bad writing experience there as well.
Well, of course, having them and the range of experiences of each of these individuals really offered a multi-spectral view of this whole period, and certainly enriched my personal understanding of that. Of course, another one of the people that is often loved to be hated is Sibley. And we do have a question in terms of the role of his alcoholism in the conflict. And so perhaps you could touch on that briefly.
Yes, his alcoholism was pretty well known, had been before the war too, since he was a career military man and, had contributed to campaigns against Navajos in 1860 with Canby and was in charge of the Taos garrison before he left. And so he was well known in the territory, and Louisa Canby actually knew him personally, which is why he came to see her when he arrived in Santa Fe. But yes, his alcoholism actually contributed, I think, to his inability to lead his troops into battle. In terms of logistics, it was actually his other big kind of issue, which was that he was just not a good organizer of men. Like, he was the exact opposite of Carleton in this context. Like, he had an abundant experience fighting in the desert. Like, he had been posted at frontier forts, his entire military career. So he knew the deal, and he did, in fact, stagger his troops. He did understand that he needed to bring that large cattle herd with him, that they needed to measure out their water supplies. So he knew enough about that, but he hated paperwork. He didn't want to do it, and he was extremely bad at it. So it was really that first delay in Texas that caused such a problem for him in the long run. And then he, of course, was completely out of the Battle of Valverde, which was a great Confederate victory that he took some responsibility for, which he shouldn't have done because he wasn't really there. He was hungover in his carriage and had really nothing to do with leading his troops into battle. He was not at Glorieta. He was not at Apache Canyon. Like, he was basically a non-entity. So that's where we see his officers really taking control and actually doing quite a good job. I mean, the Confederates were militarily on the ground quite strong. They didn't lose. You can't say that they lost any of the battles. It's just that logistically, once their wagon train was destroyed, they had no hope. And that was due to Sibley's mismanagement, which I think you can attribute to his alcoholism, but mostly to his complete lack of talent in that area.
Very good. Carson was another one I suspect you had very little direct info on, and was, of course, so much has been written about him. Mm-hmm. But we do have we're wondering what your thoughts were on his involvement and the decisions that he made. Absolutely.
Kit Carson was an interesting person to research because, of course, as you know, most of the information we have about his life and his autobiography stops before the war begins. So it's mostly that frontier history, Indian fighting, his time in California during the Mexican-American War, his work as a scout for the U.S. Army. So most people are really surprised to hear that he was an actual colonel in the U.S. Army during this period and that he was at Valverde and that he, I think probably most of you out there know him fairly well as a leader of campaigns against Navajos and Mescalero Apaches in this region at this time. But so often that's divorced from Civil War history at all. We just think of it as part of the Indian Wars. So he was a really interesting person to research. I was also very aware of his kind of mythic status. And, today and in the 1860s, I mean, he was this guy, everyone knew him. And John Clark talks about meeting him and being really impressed by him. And of course, Alonzo Ickes and Bill Davidson, two kind of privates on the field of battle, they know about him and they know he's there and they kind of want to meet him. He's already a celebrity in the region at this point. And so when I was doing research on him, I was interested in his role as both a U.S. Army officer, but also a former Indian agent, someone who spoke multiple languages of the borderlands, both Indigenous and Spanish, and was a real leader of the First New Mexico, which is this, incredibly diverse fighting force in the Civil War. And that's what I found really interesting about him was this tension that he kind of held within himself as being part of multiple worlds in this moment. I think it's fairly clear that Carleton just really wanted him to go after the Navajo community in the summer and the fall and the winter of 63, 64. He was a little more reluctant, but ultimately he did it because he was following orders. And because I think he was invested in the U.S. Army cause overall in the region. You may note, those of you who have read the book may note, Kit Carson obviously is the only person people not familiar with this part of the country and its history would know just in general because he is so famous. And so, I knew that. I knew he needed to be in the book and he needed to be a figure, but I sort of wanted to resist his pull, kind of as someone having almost too much power in the analysis of this war in this period. And so if you'll note in the book, every other protagonist has chapters named after them, except for Carson. So he always appears in battle chapters with other people. And that was a deliberate choice on my part, kind of highlight his significance, but then also kind of battle his mythic status a little bit, so that you get to see him more as a real person kind of surrounded by other people and working with other people instead of this kind of mythic frontier hero.
Well, I commend you with your efforts trying to find a proper balance and being able to highlight other players throughout. Then there's the question, of course, in terms of the Hispanic role in the conflicts, and you do speak of that in a number of places, but perhaps you could just kind of summarize that as well.
Sure. Yes. I mean, New Mexico territory is unique in the country at this point, with 50,000 Hispano-American residents who are relatively recent citizens in the country, right? And Sibley believed that he could possibly turn this enormous population and everything that they brought to the conflict, their weapons, their skills, their food, their fodder for animals, that he could turn those to the Confederate cause, because he believed that they might have actually a kind of a dog in the fight against the federal government. And they may want to kind of liberate themselves from the US, because of course, in 1846 and then 48, the US border just kind of jumped right over them, right? Many of them did not actually migrate to the United States. They just became Americans in the wake of the Mexican-American War. So it was reasonable to kind of think about and maybe ponder whether they would go fully with the United States or with the Confederacy. And of course, unfortunately, Sibley, really had either forgotten or didn't even know about the 1841 invasion, where Texans tried to take Santa Fe, and that the Hispanos living in what became New Mexico territory, what was northern Mexico, had a very long history with Texans and did not like them very much. And so that first move, where they did not actually throw in with the Confederates, was extremely important. And that meant that Sibley had a much harder road ahead of him without that help. Then, of course, Hispanos joined the first New Mexico. They joined militias. They worked as scouts and spies. They also provisioned the U.S. Army. Most of them did. Some actually broke and provisioned Sibley's troops, either in addition or instead of U.S. troops, and kind of then made their allegiances known. So it wasn't a completely monolithic community. No community ever is. But that was an extraordinary piece of help for the U.S. Army, and I think explains why they were able to win. They kept their supply lines intact because of Hispano residents. They were able to kind of thrust and parry and destroy the wagon train at Glorieta because of Hispano soldiers and guides. And Hispano soldiers took part in the campaigns against Chiricahua Apaches, and then also Navajos and Mescalero Apaches during that last phase of the war. So they were all over this story, and they participated in every single element of it. And they were soldiers, they were civilians, they were traders, they were doing all sorts of work on behalf of the United States during this period.
Thank you. I've got a number of several questions in terms that allude additional. One is that, many of the native populations did speak some Spanish, and such as Cochise. And some even had the Spanish names. Did any sense about the ability of communication with the native populations as a consequence of that? Understanding that fundamentally they were talking at cross purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a significant extent, Spanish was the language of trade and interaction in the greater Southwest during this period and in northern Mexico. So many indigenous leaders had Spanish language skills, including Mangus Coloradus and Cochise. And because there was a very complicated relationship between Hispano communities and indigenous communities in this region, basically from the 1600s on, right? There were trade relationships, raiding relationships on both sides, warfare, the taking of enslaved people on both sides. So there was a kind of there's a language of violence that is spoken, if we can get a little more, sort of abstract about it. But then there is also the Spanish language, where they would negotiate treaties. And most of the time they would have several layers of interpreter roles. But then when Americans arrived, often what you found was that the U.S. Army officer or the American trader, or whoever it was, would say something, someone would translate from English to Spanish, and then someone would translate from Spanish into an indigenous language, right? So these are all the languages in play. This is an incredibly diverse region, from the beginning of contact, European communities and indigenous communities here, and then accelerating after 1846 and the arrival of the Americans. So they could I think the important thing to note is everyone could make themselves understood. And they made themselves understood in language and also in action. And someone like Mangus Coloradus is so interesting. I was actually choosing between Cochise and Mangus Coloradus as the protagonist, the Chiricahua protagonist in the book. And I chose Mangus Coloradus because I thought it was important to kind of show his death in January of 1863 as this really pivotal moment in the relationship between Americans and Chiricahuas, and the fight between Apaches and the U.S. Army, which lasted into the 1880s. Really kind of prompted by that moment. Also, Mangus Coloradus is just a phenomenal person. He was 70 years old by this time, still alive after multiple wars, multiple injuries, and I think, all historians know, diseases during this period were just rampant and deadly. So for him to have survived this long, it was really incredible. And he also was just a tremendous leader because he had a lot of options at his disposal. He could choose diplomacy. He could choose trade. He could choose raiding. He could choose warfare. All different kinds of ways to deal with both Hispanos in Apacheria and then also Americans moving through his territory. And he was quite adept. He spoke some Spanish. He spoke a little bit of English ultimately, and then multiple variants of the Apache language. So this was one of his skills. And to succeed, I think, in the Southwest during this period, language skills were really important. We can see that with Carson also.
I think this is a good place for us to stop. We don't want to. We have a number of additional questions, and we will share these with you. And perhaps for some future dialogue. But it just is reflective, I think, of how much we appreciate you taking the time here to talk about your book and about about this important period, not only in New Mexican history but also across its impact within the greater U.S. Civil War conflict.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I did a lot of great research at the museum and multiple archives within it for this book. And I'm really thankful for that opportunity. And anyone who wants to reach out, you can, my website is megankatenelson.com, and you can find me there and just send me an email.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Thank you again. And now if I could just say a few parting words to our audience. Just a reminder you can have a chance to rewatch this presentation in all its richness, and also other presentations of the Friends of History on our webpage. We are, we're happy if we do so. I wanted to highlight just briefly our last talk and encourage you all to view last month's lecture. It was Valles Caldera, Then, Now, and to Come, by William Du Bois and Don Usner. Unfortunately, we weren't able to broadcast it live at the time. It is available on our webpage now, and we think you will find it well worth viewing when you have the time. Thank you again to our donors, not only to this lecture, but to the broader program. We ask everyone to consider making a donation so that we can continue to provide these monthly presentations. And also the donations will serve to support a broader range of New Mexico History Museum programs. So with that, goodbye for now, and we'll